So let's open it up to questions. Maybe we could take 3 or 4 questions and go ahead.
Hi. Hello? Hi. Michael O'Neill, co-chair of the Green Party of New York State. Wondering what kind of laws, reforms, tax code changes that could be implemented to facilitate the creation and maintenance of worker self-directed enterprises. How can we make it easier at every level, from local to county, state, that candidates could campaign on? The state engages in all kinds of interventions to, quote, create jobs, often with tax breaks that don't work. How can candidates campaign on facilitating the creation of worker self-directed enterprises? And where can we find out more on that kind of research that's being done to inform platforms and policy papers? Thank you.
If each of the speakers could comment briefly. Through studying this a lot on my side, what I've come up with is, the way I see it, is that the corporate structure, capitalism, in my opinion, is run by people who, before we lived in society, were the survival of the fittest. And it's now not the survival of the strongest, it's these people that have created the laws and the concept of the dollar for which we live under. And that, in effect, if you're not independently wealthy and you're working for the dollar, that we are in effect the beta males and beta women. And that is the alpha males, so to speak, that have created the structure we are under, and that will continue, the people with this power will continue to push that to the very end of, as long as they can. And that if you could just comment on if you think, agree or disagree, that it is this alpha male kind of dynamic female as well, that in the wild and in mammalian species is the strongest, survival of the fittest, where you fight and kill, has been transferred to the legal system of the dollar, where it is the strongest people that under which the rest of us live, that have to work for a living.
Thank you. And maybe just try to keep the questions a little bit brief.
Okay. My name is Odile Lugano-Heber, and I am from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I guess what my question is, I remember in France we had the LIP factories that converted into a worker-owned factory. But what happened is that we live in predatory capitalism, and how can those workers-owned cooperative can compete with this predatory capitalism and survive? I guess we have to convince our community not to go to Walmart and for people to buy local, but when their wage disappear, then what are they going to do? So it's kind of the question that I have. And in Detroit right now, we have a group of people who is trying to form a worker-owned cooperative for nursing aides and also for hospices. So do you have such example anywhere in the country where medical people are forming their own worker cooperatives? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering, is it possible to integrate into the bottom-up workplace democracy Mondragon model, well, for lack of a better term, a top-down national public planning model, because I think we face an ecological crisis of various kinds, and we need national systems like national high-speed rail, national wind, national agriculture, all kinds of policies we need in order to avoid the worst of global warming and other ecological situations. So is it possible to have a national planning process that allows us to regenerate our infrastructure at the same time that we have this bottom-up democratization of the economy? Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, let me take just one from that side, and then we'll, because I didn't see you guys, sorry.
Quickly to the French woman who just spoke, you should check out the Cooperative Home Care Associates here in the Bronx. They're a large example of what you're talking about. And to Gar, specifically, I was wondering if you could talk, using very concrete examples from the experience in Cleveland, about the tension between workplace democracy and community accountability, because I think that you guys laid out very clearly the economic rationale and cultural and political rationale for worker cooperatives, but the issue also is the ecological fact that we're destroying the earth. And so how do we address that? And how do we address the fact that workers in the oil sector or in the auto sector may actually economically redistribute the product of their labor in a very desirable way, but might actually engage in production that is socially harmful? And that raises a lot of questions about the extent to which, what the tension is between the democracy that exists in the workplace, their accountability to the community. And it also raises the issue when you're discussing this example of Cleveland, to what extent is this network that you're discussing replacing the market as a method of distribution? Because we all know the extent to which the market constrains alternative experiments in workplace organizing. So what extent does creating these community structures constrain the ability for workers to make decisions in their unit?
Thanks.
By going first, I have the pleasure of picking which part I want to answer and the least to guard all the rest. Can you all hear? Okay, good. Let me deal with the first one about laws or practical legal arrangements that one might campaign for, say in a political electoral sense, that would help. I think that's a very important issue. It's one of many ways to move this project forward. And I think there's an endless array of new laws or revisions of existing laws in the United States, for example, that could help this process along, and that it is absolutely something that Green parties and all other parties that are interested in this sort of thing can do. Some have already done them. Let me mention a couple of things that have always struck me as interesting. One of the first things this movement needs to do, and I haven't done it yet, and maybe Gar knows if someone has, is to do a systematic survey of other advanced industrial countries, and perhaps all countries, as to what in fact exists in the way of really cooperative enterprises in general, or worker co-ops in particular would be my interest, to see what the actual history of these kinds of businesses is, what has proven to help them develop, what have been major obstacles, obviously the kind of lesson we would all benefit from. I've done a little of that, and one of the earliest laws I came across is what I'm going to tell you about now, but just as an example. This is 1985 in Italy, and the Italian parliament passes something called the Marcora law, I believe named after a representative, a politician named Marcora. And what it basically does in Italy, since 1985, so they've had now quite a long history of experiments with it, is it gives unemployed people in Italy an option they do not have in the United States. Here's how it works, roughly. When you become unemployed, you can go on the dole for a year or two, pretty much like we do here in the United States. You go get your check every week, you're unemployed, and then eventually it runs out, and you hope that you find a job before that happens. In Italy, they offer that as option A, but they offer an option B. And here's that option. The government of Italy will give you your entire year or two worth of weekly payments up front as a lump sum on the following two conditions. One, you get at least, I believe it's 9 or 10 other unemployed workers to make the same choice. And, second condition, all of that money must be pooled by this group of at least 10 or 11 or however many more it might be to be used as the startup capital of a cooperative enterprise. What an interesting idea. Works pretty well in Italy. Has helped to found all manner of co-ops. Some of them have survived, some not. But the idea is you don't have people sitting for long periods of time unemployed with all of the effects on their self-esteem, their mental and physical health, Number two, you give them an incentive to make this new enterprise work because it's their own money and they can't go back on unemployment if it doesn't work out, etc. What an interesting way for the government, without using more money than they would have given that unemployed person, but to do something that is better for that person, doesn't cost the government more, and is wrapped up with the co-op enterprise idea. And by the way, you might be interested in one of the key rationales. For the United States that believes in quote-unquote freedom of choice, here's what this law would need as a defense. Americans ought to have freedom of choice to work in a top-down, hierarchical, capitalist enterprise, if they wish, or in a democratic, collective, self-directed enterprise, if they so prefer. But in order to be able to have such a freedom of choice, you have to have such enterprises for them to go work in. And what would be a more useful social service for the government to perform than to help develop such enterprises? And why not use the unemployment catastrophe as a way to help people with an enormous incentive to try to do that? And to provide them, of course, with the technical and other kinds of assistance to help get that going. In the interest of time, one other example, and I'll answer one of the other questions. We have in the United States a small business administration. We have all kinds of minority business administrations and programs. We already, as a matter of national policy, support some kinds of enterprises with preferential interest rates, so they get low interest credit, with all kinds of technical assistance, with all kinds of supports, even with government contracts, if they are something we deem useful. Minority businesses, small businesses. Well, what in the world prevents us from having a cooperative business administration, precisely to give the American people the benefit of that choice by helping to develop those and doing it on a national basis? So you could do that on a state level, you could do it on a, you could even do it on a large city level, and you certainly do it on the national level. These are examples of legal changes that could be made and that ought to be made. Competition, let me deal with that one and leave other things to Gar. It is a misreading of economics. I say that as a professor of economics. Not that that means you should listen to me 1 minute more than you would if I weren't one, but it sometimes helps. This is a country in which expertise is valued in ways that have always mystified me, so let me cash in on that. I'm an economist. Competition means that if somebody else is offering a product at a price lower than yours, you're in trouble. I could take 10 hours to give you the idea, but that's it. That's really it. If someone manages to cut their price in some way, Gar's example, by polluting or something else, good. But you always have all manner of ways of responding to that kind of competition. It is a joke of the propaganda of our business community that wants you to believe that there is only one way. The typical preference of corporations is there's only one way to solve competition, and that is to lower wages. Hello? There are lots of costs that go into the price of anything. You can cut any one of those and it'll drop the price. Here's a thought. Drop the key executives from $10 million pay packages to $150,000. It'll allow you to drop the price really nicely. That would be a clever way of competing with somebody else who's polluting. You do not, in fact, have to pollute. One of the results we know historically is if you constrain the ability of capitalists to compete by dropping their wages, they focus their competitive strategies somewhere else, like improving technology, finding cheaper inputs. All businesses will tell you this. There's always 27 things you can do. You can't do them all, but you go where you can. Monopolies are developed in the United States. Our history is full of it, by companies deciding that they're not going to compete on the level of price. So they compete somewhere else. Hello? We even prevent companies from certain kinds of competition, despite their argument that it was essential. 100 years ago, we prevented businesses in America from hiring children. Children was effective. It was a good competition. You got away with paying much less and you could drop your price. It was terrible for business not to be able to use cheap children. We made a decision as a society, you can compete, you can do whatever you want, but children, Can't do it. Well, suppose we said, you can't cut wages. You can't compete in the ways that are important for a co-op. That would be called leveling the playing field so that the co-op has certain kinds of advantages, and you can't do, as a capitalist industry, what you want to do if it undermines the co-op. And what would enable that to happen? Gar's point. Building the co-ops as a political base for the left. At a time when the left can grow but is looking for a political base, what a remarkable thing if that could be worked out as a way forward. Now, let me turn to Gar.
So let me just add to what Richard said about the laws that are available. One of the things we've discovered in working in places like Cleveland, it's amazing that we discovered it. We just sort of looked, and everybody can look. The American business community has developed dozens and dozens of special deals that help businesses. A co-op is a business. There are many things, technical assistance, indirect tax boosts, land acquisition, enormous number of things available currently in the United States tax code and the legislation that are available to any business if you can get the political support from it. It usually requires the mayor to help you. And the mayor begins to look good. So that's one thing not to ignore, that you can do a lot right now. I totally agree there are many other steps you could make special. There is a co-op bank. Footnote. Most people, you talk about socialized banks and public banks as an idea, very radical idea. Most people don't know that there are 140 public banks within the federal government today. They're not all called public banks. Some of them are. The Export-Import Bank to help corporations export and import. The Co-op Bank is another one that uses that name. But throughout the agricultural sector, for instance, there are special banks that help different parts of agriculture. There are so many precedents to build upon, and this side for the finance side of what we're talking about, it's unimaginable. And we haven't looked at here's a job for those of you who are interested in this. We haven't looked at all the available supports existing now in public policy that can be transformed and used, in addition to the steps forward, like the Marcora law that could be added, et cetera. There is a panoply of things that can be done and should be done. A lot of them developed out of the agricultural cooperative political movement of the 1930s, where there are places to look for other ways to expand. And still one more point to mention. The current law, put together by a maverick corporate guy who saw how his own corporate leaders were making money, and Huey Long's son, who happened to be chairman of the Senate Finance Committee in the early 1970s, provides very large incentives for people who retire and sell their company to the workers. Mostly this has been set up under the so-called ESOP form. We could get into that, it's too complicated. It also permits selling to worker co-ops. Now, a little light bulb ought to go on here. Over the next decade, several million people who are the baby boom people will retire, and they're going to have to get rid of their companies. And if their kids don't want them, their choice is to sell to a big corporation without the incentives or sell to the workers with the incentives. There is an enormous possibility here that we haven't even addressed if you want to begin to transfer and build ownership structures. And if you look carefully, begin to dig, there are numerous possibilities of this kind that you can already use or build upon. So that has to do with the legal question. I do want to talk a little bit about this community, the question about oil companies and auto companies. There is a problem which we haven't confronted, and you can exaggerate this, so I'm doing this as an exaggerated form. If you're the workers who own the oil industry, you may be in a different political position than the workers who own the garbage industry. It isn't necessarily the case that worker-owned companies in a free market will produce an egalitarian society. So the question becomes, and that's why these framework issues become very important, and why I have been urging and stressing, to the degree possible, community-wide structures, to the degree possible, whether at the local level, the national level, the national community, the state level, or probably in a continental system like the United States, the regional level. Incidentally, they're trying to sell off the Tennessee Valley Authority. Some good, some bad, and the Republicans are against it. Why? Because everybody loves this socialized enterprise in the Tennessee Valley, the largest utility in the country. The Obama administration is trying to sell it off because it'll make their budget look a little better. So there are many precedents to look for, but let me stress this one. In a community, I mentioned in a community-wide structure, to the degree, and in Cleveland this is similar, to the degree you pollute, you actually pollute your own community. So internalizing that externality is one step in the argument. And here's another one which is a little more subtle, but I think even more important. Ultimately, the system that I think we will create will involve a fair amount of public activity, which in one form or another involves economic planning, whether you call it that or not. The Marcora Law is one of those. What are the criteria generated by actual experience that give guidance and set the parameters of whatever economic national policy we have? What are the criteria that create that? You can't just hope, certainly anybody studying political economy and history says, you can't just hope we can paste on regulatory strategies on the system. One of the questions is whether the actual experience of people in everyday life builds a cultural, political experience that the community as a whole has an interest in ecological issues. And that set of cultural developments becomes the nurturing ground, the hothouse in which a culture of ecological sustainability gets built so that it can inform and not lose power at the national planning level or the regional planning level or the state planning. Without that, there is an incentive for workers to pollute if the next worker-owned company across the state pollutes as well. Unless you can get that somehow arranged, you're in trouble in any system. So building the culture that will sustain and nurture the larger criteria, whether they're called laws or planning system, I think becomes a critical element in all this. And that goes to the French question that was also asked, because we are talking, I think, when we build up from where we now are. And let's talk about it in phases. Right now, we're getting things on the ground, we're getting ideas going, we're getting people understanding this, we're trying to build a movement that builds. That's a major step for the next decade and well beyond the next couple decades. There are next steps beyond that involve these kinds of policies and planning when there's enough political support for them. And at that level, I think we're going to be needing capacities so that when one company actually shuts down, you can transform to another. So what would be an example? If you had, national money, taxpayer money is going to support it all for rail systems, as I said earlier, in mass transit. If the auto industry goes down as it should, there would be a capacity actually to target new jobs in from the public sector in a different planning modality. That's your only ultimate answer to the question that the woman from France raised, but that is a step down the line. And then the question becomes whether in our developmental work ourselves, and this is critical for us now, that we are beginning to theorize and plan and look for experiments and developing experiments at the state and local level that gives us enough solid understanding and information so we can then, in fact, implement them as time goes on.
So I know we are really short on time, so we're going to do a lightning quick 2 responses with 2 questions left, one from the gentleman over here and one from the gentleman over here. Please go ahead.
Okay, very briefly. This was very informative and exciting. I just have one thing that I wanted to add, and this also relates to the question about tax incentives. Professor Wolff talked about the micro and the macro. I think there's also an intermediate scale, and that pertains to big corporations. I have proposed in a recent book a tax incentive that would facilitate or promote the worker ownership and control of big corporations. And it's very simple. You take the corporate income tax, and instead of paying it to the government, you create worker equity. So instead of a third of profits going to government, a third of the equity will go to the workers. And that would end up with maybe workers having three members on the board as well as some equity.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was just a question about finance and class struggle, really, and about the notion that although we're building things up on the ground now, we're looking forward to this moment in the near future where we come face to face with the capitalists, and we're trying to play them at their own game, basically. We're trying to actually compete with capitalist firms. And you talked about, so I just wanted to ask the panel if there have been any efforts or discussions yet between cooperative networks in different cities to use and share their surpluses to help each other out, so that in the event of a moment where a cooperative is competing with a capitalist firm, cooperative from somewhere else could help them out with, with some of their surplus value, and if there's been conversation about that, or if there are any institutions being set up to try and cope with that.
Thank you.
That's all.
So, a minute each, maybe?
I want to deal again with this question of the competition. The Mondragon experience of 50 years does show the crucial nature of helping one another. So at this point that co-ops, once you get going, and we arguably already have enough of that in the United States to begin to create the networks among them so they can help each other. Mondragon, for example, moves people who are not needed in one enterprise over into jobs. One of the reasons they are able to guarantee job security in a way that capitalist enterprises cannot do, because of the network within the co-op movement of that kind of flexibility. And so yes, of course the co-ops would help. One of the projects I'm working on is to develop a kind of Craigslist in which all of you that might want to be supportive of a co-op will have a place to go on the internet, and instead of buying where you were about to buy from anything else, you will be given a complete menu of every co-op in the United States, whatever it's producing, all the conditions under which it's producing, so you can go there and buy. The same Craigslist will say, if you want a job in a co-op, here's the 84 co-ops around the country that are looking to hire. And if you want to start a co-op, here are 47 other people who have indicated on this website that they are also in this part of the country interested in starting a co-op. In other words, this kind of connection, which the internet actually facilitates, is part of how this process is getting going. Yep. Last comment about community involvement on the broader issue. Germany in the 1920s, the so-called Weimar Republic, organized a parliament in a different way. Instead of there being a House of Representatives and a Senate or the equivalent of that, they had one kind of legislative house being drawn by people who vote in a neighborhood where they reside, the way we do. But the other parliament was composed of people voting from the workplace where they were employed, so that you had to have both houses agree on legislation, but the legislation had to reflect the interests of the residential community on the one hand and the labor community on the other. If you want to know how democratically self-directed worker enterprises would have to function, they would have to be codependent, interdependent, and co-respective with the communities impacted. Otherwise, you don't have democracy. Since a business decision impacts the residential community and vice versa, there has to be the co-decision by your identity as a resident, but your other identity as a working director of enterprises, in order to make a genuine democracy be respective of the interests of a community that are not identical with the interests of a work collective.
So I love that last example, because it is one of the many different ways that, if you see this period as critical to the developmental of the next vision, developing the next vision, you will begin to look for that kind of model. That's one way to balance community and worker-owned issues. The Cleveland model is another one. There are a range of things that people who actually roll up their sleeves and get into doing this, as well as theorizing about it, I think are going to get a proliferation at trying to work out these things. And I love the Craigslist idea. That's a great idea. But what's happening, I go around the country. Rick has been doing far more of this, but I've been going around the country. Almost every place I go, 10 people come up to me afterward with something new that I'd never heard of that's going on that is in this different realm of discussion. So the one thing I want to pick up and talk about just a little bit more in terms of one of the questions here is why it is critical, in my view, to begin understanding the broad movement that's going on. That is the community ownership, the land trusts, the public utilities. 350 cities now are capturing methane from the garbage, turning it into electricity and setting up public companies to do that. The public banks, the things that are going on, the land trusts that are going on in various realms that are all associated with democratizing capital. they are also critical elements in, sometimes the language is the new economy, building a power base, and that we need to have a broader vision to build a power base to achieve this goal. And one way to symbolize that and why I want to stress it in closing is this. If you look at the best examples we have so far of worker self-management and worker ownership are Mondragon on the one hand and the Emilia-Romagna co-ops in Italy and the other co-ops in Italy on the other hand. That's the ones we look at. They both came out of very unique experiences, both of them partly because the local culture was highly repressed, on the one hand by Franco's destruction of the Basque people if he could, and by Mussolini's attack, fascism's attack on that part of the red belt of largely communist in Italy. Very special conditions that produced them, which we hopefully don't replicate. But even more, and it's really interesting to see, even so, though these are the best models, in the Basque country, Mondragon only employs less than 4% of the population, and in Spain as a whole, 1.3% of the population. And all of the co-ops in Italy have only achieved 6% of the population, and we're talking in the 6% of the population in the Emilia-Romagna regions, and less than 3% nationally in Italy. So either we find a way to build a broader movement, or possibly to do better than these particular models that everyone points to, or I think we're going to be marginalized. So I'm